Hello and welcome everybody. My name's Ryan, the official host here on Reddit Voice, bringing you guys another episode of r/ProRevenge. Before we get into it though, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that subscribe button and that notification bell to stay up to date on all the latest videos. Fire me before I quit? I ruin your life, my friend. Since I'm still in school, I took a job at a bakery of types which I won't name. This place has bread in the name, but also sells overpriced salads and sandwiches. I worked there for close to a year, where I had this boss named Betty. Not her real name, of course. Betty and I didn't get along whatsoever. She'd gotten the previous general manager to quit because she had an affair with him, and she threatened to tell his wife if he didn't leave. He quickly left the job, and she was promoted to the position. I didn't like her, but I have to respect the dedication to be the general manager of a small-ass store. When I first started working there, I was respectful, but she would do things that would get on my nerves. For instance, I would clean all the places I would be hired to do so, and once I was done and relaxed for 5 minutes, she would run out of the manager's office screeching, "Why aren't you working?" I would tell her, of course, I did my job, and as a cashier, if nobody's here to help, then I didn't have anything to do. She would just glare at me, and then I would see her accidentally drop an entire pot of brewed coffee onto my freshly mopped floor for me to clean. So I learned quickly to always look busy. Once she realized I was going to kneel and kiss the ground she walked on, she started dropping my hours. The store ran on a Game of Thrones type politics for those who got promotions and raises. Somehow, all her friends were managers and would bully the rest of us. She was barely at work. She would drive to my job, clock just in case corporate decided to check her hours, so she was essentially stealing those hours. When you clocked in, it printed out a small piece of paper telling you when you clocked in. She would just drop them on the floor for me to clean up, and I would usually pick them up and stick them into a pocket. So this led me to finding Betty clock in and out stubs in my pocket at my house. This will be important later. Did I mention she was super racist? She was white, and most of the staff and my fellow high school peers, who were mostly all people of color. So one day, she walked out and told us, "When you're on this clock, I own you." When we all reacted to look at her, she backpedaled and was like, "I didn't mean it like that." This'll be important for later. So after a while, I got sick of practically begging for hours, so I went to my current job. But I decided I merely wanted to drop my hours, which were allegedly already barely a day a week. But suddenly, when I got my new job, she scheduled me every single day of an entire week. She never did that, even when we were on semi-good terms. So I obviously told her I had a new job and couldn't do this. After that, I went home and called my friend who was still working there to tell him I was going to quit tomorrow. He has a bad habit of putting his phone on speaker when he's cleaning at work, so Betty overheard this obviously. The next day, I walk in and go through the respectful motions of saying thank you for the opportunity and blah blah blah. Betty let me go through the entire speech before she said, "Oh yeah, I was meaning to tell you. You're fired." I was so blindsided and pissed I cussed her out. My mom raised me to treat women with respect, but this effing fat, overweight, hippo-looking bitch pissed me the hell off. She's the type of girl to think binge eating was a personality trait. So I left, and I was mad about being fired before I could quit, but didn't push the issue. I'm only 18, and I already had another job. I wasn't expecting Betty to give me a good reference anyway. I would have completely left it alone if it wasn't for the district manager, Ben, not real name, texting me. The Revenge. He thought I was still working there, so I explained to him I was fired. He was stunned due to the fact that I was a decent employee. He asked why she let me go, and I explained it to him, and he was pissed. He clarified that she fired me before I quit, and I said yes. He was pissed that she did this, and asked if there was anything else she might have done. I kinda just vented to him for a bit, and when I told him about the racist remark, he asked if anyone would collaborate with me. I forgot to mention that she slowly fired and forced people to quit, and replaced them with her friends and family, which according to company policy she couldn't do. Something about conflict of interest. I asked all the people who were working that day if they could, and a few said they would and that they did, but one did even better. My one coworker, Andy, is convinced he's the next big vlogger, so he always has his phone out or just using audio recording for hours for a chance to catch my funny clip. I've watched his content and let me say it's just super cringe. But turns out he labels each recording by the day and times. So when we checked, he found her making racist remarks. I got a brilliant idea, and my other fired or co-workers who were forced to quit decided to scour Andy's recordings. We found some great moments of Betty saying controversial things or just being nasty. Like once a guest sneezed on the baked pastries, and when a coworker told her, she laughed it off and said nobody would know. But this wasn't enough for me. I try to avoid conflict, but when I'm in a situation, I'll follow through. I looked her up on Facebook and found out she was married. Nobody knew this, so when she had the affair with the other manager and basically blackmailed him, she was also married and cheating. I don't think anyone's ever cared enough to find out because she was a nasty old lady. So I found the old manager's Facebook and found out he and his wife were separated. Turns out even after he quit, Betty was still trying to blackmail money out of him. When he didn't, she told his wife anyway, causing his wife to divorce him and basically leaving him to go back to live with his parents. I did some research in my state, and blackmail or extortion is a third-degree penalty which has a max of 7 years in prison with a fine over $10,000 to the victim. So I told the old manager what my plan was for her, and he agreed to call the cops on her, but I asked if he'd wait until I finished my part first. He said he'd give me a week. So I met with my district manager, Ben, and showed him all of our evidence, the recordings and the written statements from my other ex-coworkers and people who were still working there. I also gave Ben the slips of paper when Betty clocked in and then left and returned 8 to 10 hours later to clock out. Ben thanked me for the information and then I left. A few days later, while walking past the store, I noticed it was closed in the middle of the day. I texted a guy who still worked there and he told me everything. Turns out Ben first checked the security cams to see if she was there for the full time she claimed to be. Big surprise, she wasn't, so Ben decided to investigate the store's expenses, since if she's lying about her time, what else could she be stealing? He found out she was stealing money from the store. The guy didn't fully explain how she was, but just that she was. Turns out she was breaking a lot of health and safety codes and used the money for repairs and etc. for herself. So she was fired immediately along with all of her minions that left barely anybody to run the store. They shut to clean up the store and fix things she didn't make. So she's out of a job, and Mark told her husband with proof, granny nudes, I know, ew, that she cheated on him, but Mark phrased it so it seemed like she still was. So Betty's husband flips out and decides to divorce her, and Betty's the type to post everything on Facebook. Since she's begging for someone to let her stay, but all of her friends and family totally bailed on her. So she's living in her car and looking for a job. That's when Mark decides to sue her for extortion. So she scrambles to find a lawyer, and to make it even worse, the company decided to sue her for all the money she stole, plus all the repairs and lost revenue while the store is closed. Betty's life is shit. She had to sell her car for drastically under what it's worth to pay for all the legal trouble. Mark told me bits and pieces of her crying in the courtroom, but not too much. I was never super close with him. Last I heard of Betty is she was living with her sister, who definitely hates her. To think she would have avoided all of this if she'd just let me quit. Edit. I'd like to answer a few questions most people had about the validity of the story. First off, I didn't have a good relationship with Betty, so there would be no reason I would ever look her up online. Besides, I don't even have Facebook, so I had to actually look her name up to find it. Next is my friend accidentally recording her racist remarks. Don't most of you know that one friend who is sure they're going to be famous or obsessed with their online image? He's like that, and it gets annoying when he thinks every moment is a photo opportunity. Next is the timeline. Not all of this occurred as quickly as I stated. I had to cut some parts out for the sake of the story. You wouldn't want to read because it's basically a filler arc in a Reddit story. TLDR, my manager fired me because I could quit. And so I got her fired, divorced, and sued for extortion and fraud. And it's true, you guys. I was the bagel that got sneezed on. My Catholic teacher calls for my suspension for asking the wrong questions. I decide to behave. This happened years ago at what would turn out to be my last year at Catholic school for reasons that will become obvious. I don't have anything against people of faith, but this was not my thing, very early on. I was 12 years old and in 7th grade. I was becoming disenchanted with my Catholic upbringing. I had so many questions, and it might have saved my faith to have them answered reasonably. The adults didn't want to reason with a curious 12-year-old. They wanted to raise a nice Catholic girl who didn't feel compelled to make so much distasteful noise. Sex ed was still a part of any Catholic curriculum, and as it turned out, my religion teacher, Mrs. M, was also my sex ed teacher. When she opened up on our first sex ed class with, "Now I'm just as embarrassed to be here as you are," I didn't see it as an expression of empathy. I saw it as a grown woman humiliated to be teaching basic biology. It made me sad. Junior high sex ed wasn't just biology. Though it was an effort to shape our view of the world, Mrs. M taught us sexual health as per Catholic doctrine, and also peppered in some of her own weird personal viewpoints, shaped by her own history, I guess. We had this box at the front of the class where we could discreetly write down and drop off questions we were too nervous to ask out loud. Someone asked what orgasms feel like for women. We knew men ejaculate, but what do women do? Mrs. M did not explain, perhaps because she hadn't had one a day in her life. She said, "The women's orgasm is not a necessary part of sex. It is not necessary for procreation, and sex is for the purposes of procreation." That sounded very dodgy to me. I brought her statement home to my mother, who had always been very open with me about these things. I asked her if women really weren't supposed to enjoy sex all that much. She was horrified. She told me lots of men like to make women feel good, and sex should feel good for everyone. She said something that would be lastingly valuable. Ask questions in that class. Teachers are supposed to answer your questions, and if they can't, maybe they shouldn't be teachers. The next class, Mrs. M taught us that homosexuality was a sin. This was too much for me. I had a gay uncle who had been a huge fixture in my life. I felt attraction to girls in my class, and I refused to believe God would think who you love is worthy of hellfire. She went on to say gay marriage was both impossible and wrong. I raised my hand and asked her plaintively, "What is gay marriage, or why is gay marriage wrong?" Her answer was, "Because they cannot procreate, and procreation is the purpose of marriage." I sat silently. I didn't demonstrate agreement nor dissent. I went home and thought about it for a while. I needed to come back to my sex ed class with an inquiry that was going to properly F Mrs. M's stuff up. It didn't seem like an easy task, but I came up with something that I thought was worth trying out. The next sex ed class rolled around, and Mrs. M taught whatever stuffy, deplorable lesson she had in the plan. Then she opened up the class to questions. I raised my hand and she called on me, and I said, "If a woman is infertile, but she really loves the man she is with and wants to share the sacrament of marriage with him, does the church approve the marriage?" It was a no-brainer for her, of course. I followed up with, "But she can't have children, and marriage is for procreation. Why can she get married, but two men or two women who can't procreate can't?" Anyone who is seasoned in Christian apologetics can explain this one pretty easily. But it had hit Mrs. M somewhere deeply personal in front of her 30 other children. Mrs. M was a married woman of around 50 or so, with no children of her own. Very unusual for a Catholic woman who doesn't believe in birth control. Mrs. M was infertile, and to her I was questioning the sanctity of her marriage and its validity in the eyes of God she had dedicated her life to. It was a sucker punch, and she couldn't collect herself to punch back. She instead flew into a rage. Her face became a deep shade of red as she'd said, "This is not a debate class," and sent me to the office. For context, I didn't know Mrs. M was infertile. It's something my mother told me post-office battle. An apology letter was determined to be insufficient by Mrs. M. My mom came to collect me, and a battle ensued. Mrs. M wanted blood by way of suspension, and my mother was having none of it. Curious kids don't get suspended for questioning what they're taught. The only thing that worked in my favor was my history of being a nerdy, non-disruptive child with good grades. A compromise was struck. I wouldn't get suspended, but I could not participate in sex ed class nor religion class. My grades in those classes would be determined solely by the written portions. These written portions were completed at a desk positioned outside the classroom, which Mrs. M smugly carried out for me every class. I didn't mind working outside the classroom because to me it was a good example of the ease in which an adult can collapse under a child's questioning. I decided that religion and sex ed would become my specialty classes. I would master the curriculum, I would get the best grades I could, and Mrs. M would have to watch it happen. I worked very hard, harder than I had in any other classes. I studied at length and did additional research online, and I finished out the semester with about a 95 in sex ed and a 98 in religion. The final exams for both classes were entirely multiple choice. I was permitted into the classroom to be supervised for the exams, and there was no room for her biases to creep into her grading. She passed me the Scantron sheet back from my religion exam, 100%. I thanked her with a saccharine smile. She fixed me with a grim expression before moving on to the next classmate. A few days later, it was the Scantron sheet for the sex ed exam, 100%. I said, "Thank you for all you've taught me." As I smiled up at her, she said something under her breath and moved on. Mrs. M hated me with a distinctly unchristlike passion, and she found other ways to express it in the following semester. It warms my heart little to think of her having to grade all my schoolwork, one correct answer after the other. The relentlessly curious heretic nerd girl was a pain in her side that wouldn't go away. Worst of all, she demonstrated that she understood what you were teaching. She just didn't believe in it. TLDR, my Catholic sex ed teacher tried to punish me for questioning doctrine. A compromise punishment was struck, and I, in turn, resolved to ace all her classes. She hated me with a passion and had to grade all my assignments correctly and watched me get honors. And with that final story, we've reached the end of today's r/ProRevenge. If you liked it, make sure to leave a like on the video and check out all our other videos to check out all that cool stuff. As always, my name's Ryan, the official host here at Reddit Voice, and I look forward to seeing each and every one of you guys in our next video.